Okay, GME. So this is actually going to be a tough forecast because A, we have conflicting data, and B, we have earnings this week. So I'll do my best, but take everything with a grain of salt in this one. I'll try to lay out the bullish scenarios and the bearish scenarios, and you guys can know what to look out for if price crosses certain levels. So to start, this is the single most encouraging thing I've seen in this stock over the past 2 months, the single most bullish encouraging thing. So let's take a look at, the trading range since August 26th, which is when the weekly velocity turned negative. So throughout this entire time period, the weekly velocity was negative enough to tell us that price will not be able to break above this weekly trigger. Or even if it does break above, we have to expect it to be pulled back right back down before the weekends. Now, sure enough, that is what happened. In the past 2 months, price has not been able to break above the weekly trigger. And the good news about the close on Friday is that GME finally repaired its negative weekly velocity to the point where if price would challenge the weekly trigger, which came down now to 29.33, it would be possible for price to at least pin here, if not break above, but we would not expect it at this point to get rejected and come right back down like it did here. We would expect it to maybe pin for a week and then fully repair the weekly velocity to get, we want to print under -1. So -0.09 would be excellent. Right now it's still -0.13. So we wouldn't expect a break straight above, but we wouldn't expect a rejection, which is what we're at here. Now this is, a bounce off support. We had positive weekly velocity. GME came down to the weekly trigger and broke above it. Over here, GME had negative weekly velocity, came up, pinned around for a week, repaired its negative weekly velocity to -0.07. Here it was -1.7. So I'll just zoom in on this. This is how it works. So -1.7 isn't negative enough to a point where you'd expect price to get crushed right back down, but it's called pinning velocity, which means price is going to attack the weekly trigger, pin a bit, but during its pinning stage, it'll repair the weekly velocity under -1, which it did right here. The weekly velocity is -0.7, and then price can break above and make a strong move to the upside, which is what we saw. Price broke above the weekly trigger at 33 and moved all the way up to 40, which pre-split is a $40 move in the span of July 2nd to July 20th, only eight trading days. And then with positive weekly velocity, price caught support on the weekly trigger and moved up all the way from 33 to 47, which is a humongous move that happened in a very short period of time. So GME is setting up for something very similar right now. It can come up to the weekly trigger this week. Again, I have to pretend that earnings won't impact price to try to give a forecast. Whether it does or doesn't, that's something I can't control. I'm just saying how I would read it if there was no earnings. So if there was no earnings, I would read it that GME can come up and pin near the weekly trigger at 29.33 because the weekly velocity is -1.3. And after it can repair even more weekly velocity throughout the week, we'd get a print anything less than -1, like here, -0.07, and then in 2 weeks, GME could break above the weekly trigger, which will which is likely to cause a really strong upside move in price, as the weekly trigger is a very strong acceleration level. Hence, we saw when GME finally broke below the weekly trigger, it accelerated down from 34 all the way down to 24 in a very short period of time. So the weekly trigger does act as a strong acceleration level. Now, the bearish side is that with the monthly velocity actually came down this month. So GME repaired the monthly velocity for the month of November, allowing for a break above the monthly trigger, which is also a really strong acceleration level and can send price moving really strongly to the upside. But on December 1st, monthly velocity came back down again to -2.6. Now, this monthly print tells us that Animoy isn't supportive of the idea that price can rocket right above the monthly trigger. But because the reason why this isn't super bearish is because the weekly trigger is just under the monthly trigger. If GME can break above the weekly trigger either this week or next week, odds favor next week, and accelerate strongly enough from the weekly trigger straight through the monthly trigger, then GME can repair its monthly velocity and make a really strong move to the upside after breaking through a 2-trigger cluster of the weekly trigger and the monthly trigger at once. So what I mean is, in case that was confusing, if the weekly trigger wasn't here, then odds would not favor a break above the monthly trigger for GME because of this negative monthly velocity. But because the weekly trigger is just below, which acts as a really strong acceleration level, if if GME can power through the weekly trigger, it might be strong enough to take price straight through the monthly trigger as well. And any break above these levels, based on history of an EMOI, price breaking through the weekly trigger and the monthly trigger at once, will lead to a powerful, strong upside stampede in price, and can very likely see a lot of short covering as people on the wrong side of this trade realize that price is about to run to the upside whether they cover or not, and do not want to be trapped underwater. So that's the update for GME. There's also, on the micro level, a bullish cross. So we know that the hourly trigger did cross above the daily trigger on Friday, which is, a bullish cross. And 8 or 9 times out of 10, when you have a cross like this, the next stop price will make is the weekly trigger. So I do think there's a very good chance on Monday that price rockets straight to this weekly trigger to fill this air pocket. Most times when price breaks above the daily trigger and then the hourly trigger crosses above, within a very short period of time, we can expect price to attack the trigger above, which is the weekly trigger at 29.33. So my best bet, the date today is the 4th, so earnings isn't until Wednesday. My best bet is that price will see 29.33 before Wednesday, or at least 29, at least really close to the weekly trigger. I've seen this set up 100 times. Again, price breaking above the daily trigger, hourly trigger crosses. Almost always the next stop price will make is this weekly trigger. So I carried light call exposure over the weekend in hopes that price does fill this air pocket. I did think there was a big chance that it could fill on Friday, and so I took a bunch of YOLO ODT calls, 0 days to expiration, because, if they hit, that's a humongous win, and if they don't, had a great week anyway. So my forecast would be that before Wednesday, I expect price to attack 29.33. Invalidation for this move is a move back down below 26.35, but that's really unlikely from the way I look at it. If you guys want to see a different example of this, we can look at BBBY real quickly. So BBBY broke above the daily trigger, and then the hourly trigger crossed, and this was August 4th, and within 4 days it attacked the weekly trigger. So this is, GME would be like right here or right here in this scenario. Probably find something on AMC as well. Yeah, so AMC right here, daily trigger crossed the weekly trigger. And then price made its way to the hourly trigger crossed the daily trigger, and price made its way to the weekly trigger. Probably find one on SoFi, I think. But this is a very, very frequent scenario. Once the hourly trigger, so the hourly trigger crosses the daily trigger, and then price makes its way to the weekly trigger in a short time after. Could look at Tilray. So Tilray, hourly trigger crosses the daily trigger, and price makes its way to the weekly trigger. So I know GME is, a lot of people believe that it's a very hard stock to track, but for me to give a forecast that GME is going to attack 29.33 very early in this week does not seem like a reach. To me, it just seems like that's the most likely scenario. So we'll see how it plays out. Good luck, everyone.